Okay. I want to welcome everybody, and I'm going to introduce myself and the conversation that we're going to have today. My name is Deborah Thomas, and I direct the Center for Experimental Ethnography at the University of Pennsylvania. The Center for Experimental Ethnography, otherwise known as the CEE, is an interdisciplinary research center and creative lab that promotes ethical, engaged, and experimental multimodal research that is generated ethnographically. We believe that multimodal research practices transform how we generate knowledge and how we remain accountable to the communities in which we interact and through which our research circulates. So we support multimodal scholarship and research by hosting visiting fellows, coordinating workshops and conferences, supporting undergraduate and graduate research, engaging with arts and community-based organizations throughout Philadelphia, and forging connections with other like-minded institutions worldwide. This semester, we've been pleased to host Emily Karras and Wayne Modest as our fellows, and I would like to introduce them before we get into the conversation that we're going to have. Emily Karras is a mixed media visual artist and educator who also founded the Art Department Collective, a nonprofit arts collective and community art space dedicated to sharing stories and uplifting underserved minority artists here in Philadelphia. She holds a BA in Education Photography from Eugene Lang College in New York and an MFA in Photography from the University for the Creative Arts in Canterbury, England. She's also a board member of CultureWorks, a management commons for arts, heritage, and creative communities. Emily has had a number of solo exhibitions, and her work has been featured in group exhibitions in New York, Pennsylvania, and London. Her work concerns self-discovery and the healing of historical wounds. It explores the personal and cultural legacies of slavery, particularly in relation to the Black female body, and it engages with the history of gendered craft production and the role of women in memorialization. Wayne Modest is the head of the Research Center for Material Culture, housed within the trio of ethnographic museums in the Netherlands. He is also professor of material culture and critical heritage studies in the Faculty of Humanities at the Vrije University in Amsterdam. Prior to these appointments, Wayne was head of the curatorial department at the Tropen Museum, the keeper of anthropology at the Horniman Museum of London, and director of the Museums of History and Ethnography in Kingston, Jamaica. Wayne's research interests include issues of belonging and displacement, material mobilities, histories of ethnographic collecting and exhibiting practices, and, like Emily, redress and repair. So we are having a conversation today that had originally been planned as a moderated conversation that would have happened during the Screening Scholarship Media Festival this weekend. This festival is organized each year by CAMERA, which is the graduate student collective interested in multimodal research and creative practice at Penn. Given the current conditions, we've had to cancel the festival and all public activities, so we thought we would take the conversation online and send it out to all of you. So initially, when thinking through the themes of what they wanted to discuss together, Wayne and Emily had come up with a title that was, quote, "Just Cut Us Some Slacks," a conversation between Emily Karras and Wayne Modest, and I'll ask them also to elaborate what that title really meant. They had also imagined, what they would consider, and they came up with the themes of love, joy, laughter, being Black today, and materiality, all in their various guises. Given the way things have changed, however, we also want to talk about the roles of archives and preservation, digitality, and institutional responsibilities. But I want to start things off today by asking you to talk a little bit about the courses that you've been teaching this semester, both of which dealt in different ways with questions of materiality. And I'm hoping you can outline the kinds of issues that you had wanted students to address. Emily, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this semester I've been working in collaboration with Joanne Douglas and Dr. Grace Anderson Johnson, um, really looking at like the central focal point being issues of escape on the water for Black bodies. So we were looking at the Clean Water Act as kind of a central focal point, and looking at that very neutral language and the way that our government attempts to be stewards in a very neutral way of these waters, but they end up certainly disproportionately impacting groups of color, and really kind of dictating how we can use these spaces safely. So in that, kind of triangulating that into modes of escape for Black bodies, the water being a massive mode of escape. We were interested in taking this work and making it a little bit more tangible. So we're teaching them these sort of life skills of in regards to escape. So my portion of this work was also to bring sewing into the mix and create a sail with the students, which we indigo dyed, and we started sewing up, but unfortunately because of the change in circumstances, we have yet to be able to complete it, but they will. And on the sail, it has the breakdown of the introduction of the Clean Water Act, where the students dissected these words and really thought about and rearranged what they meant, what they were designed to do, and also how to respond to them. So that's been largely what we've been covering. And we've also been taking, a number of different texts and having the students really think about and triangulate and layer on what the experience is to be a Black body in relationship to water, especially in this country, given the history of slavery, and then also given the limits to our access of water, even from something as simple as swimming, which is a survival skill, to being able to have religious ceremonies in the Schuylkill or in the Delaware. Yeah, I guess I'll stop there, but
yeah. And initially, weren't you planning on building the entire ship?
Yeah, so
and launching it in Bartram's.
Yeah, and that's something that we're continuing to, the three of us are very interested in this work. And so and it becomes so much urgent given our current situation to think about survival in the ways, the skills even that we need, or, the precariousness of what the future holds at this point. So the initial idea was to build a ship, get the sail up, and then take it down. So we're working with Bartram's and Joanne to eventually be able to build the structure in the ship. And
they're still getting their boating licenses, right?
Yeah, so the students are getting their boating licenses. A big part of this was making sure that they had some tangible skills when they were walking out of class. So the boating license, the nice thing about it is it's a universal one, so they can take it wherever they go, and it's something that lasts forever. So
yeah. So skills plus a kind of historical and theoretical background related to issues of fugitivity, right? And survival and escape. Yeah, lovely. Yeah. And undergrad or grad?
Mainly undergrad. We had one grad student.
Okay. Yeah. And Wayne, what has your class been focused on this semester?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks. I mean, this has been even if disrupted time, it has been a time for thinking a lot and thinking through what, in my own location, located in what we call an ethnographic museum, what is at stake in a museum like that, a museum that emerges close to anthropology as a discipline that where a lot of objects were acquired, especially in European museums from all over the world, through the colonial and with the colonial project. So my class has been called, it was a class that I jointly developed with a colleague of mine in the Netherlands, Wouter Verhaat, called It Was the Law at the Time. And the reason for that specific title was that right now across very many museums across not only Europe and America, but worldwide, there is a push towards the question of who owns cultural objects in museums. Should museums return the objects that they have in their collections, objects that, without question, some of which were stolen, and what do museums do with those collections, what many people have called colonial collections. So one of the very often response that museums or heritage practitioners give when they're accused of stealing is that it was the law at the time. So together with the students, we've been trying to interrogate what is at stake in that statement. You know, what are some of the, how do we understand the law in relationship to questions of property, ownership? What is legal under the colonial? So it is a class that reads across legal philosophy, anthropology, but also reads works that deal with more questions around repair and repairing historical wrongs. And so we've been just reading together and thinking together and tying that together with more popular conversations around the questions of what is legal, what is legality, how does something become legal, normalized as legal. I mean, for many people, my opening class was showing that film, which everybody knows, the Black Panther film, which has that one scene at this place called a museum in Britain, which is, you know, where the protagonist stands in front of the display case and announces that the objects were stolen. And so we use that as a starting point to think through what is also at stake in the more popular imagination and how certain part in popular culture, we are also in popular culture, but also artistic practice, we are pushed to reimagine what these normative ideas come to mean for us as cultural institution. But also, one of the things that is important in that is not, which we tend to do, is to kind of abstract the museum out of normal life. So we say that the museum has certain laws, and then there's normal life that has different things, different laws. But no, we read works such as Whiteness as Property, very, very central work. The Colonial Lives of Property, which is a recent book that came out by this woman called Brenna Bandar. Or last week we were reading a book called White Possessive, to try and just think through how the law has been used in its racializing mode to fashion subjugation, to fashion violence, to make legitimate violence, but at the same time to ensure that cultural heritage institutions benefit, in some places benefit, whereas other institutions don't benefit at all. So that's a part of what we've been doing together, which has been an exciting conversation. And for me, it's exciting also because all of my courses bring in reggae and dancehall and a little bit of hip hop here and there, because I want us to also think that theoretically, Vibes Cartel has enough to tell us about what is legality, in as much as us reading somebody like Charles Mills, who speaks about racial contract. So we read those things together to try and think about how popular imaginations of freedom, of liberty, of justice can help us to reorganize our thinking as museums, as to what is at stake in the simple statement, it was the law at the time.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks for that. And I'm sure anybody who's watching is sort of in the same boat, but all of our teaching for the rest of the semester is online. So I was wondering how that has affected your classes in particular. It's been, you know, for many of our design students pursuing BFAs or MFAs or any of the clinical students, it has a very different effect to go to online remote education than for some of the other kinds of classes, my graduate seminar, for example, where we can still get together and talk in this kind of a venue about readings or concerns or issues or engagements. So talk a little bit about what this contemporary reality has meant for the kinds of engagements that you had hoped for in your classes.
Well, we've had the hands-on portion of this work, unfortunately, is on pause. Given that the students are scattered across the country and all of the sewing machines are here. So that's been That's been difficult. It's been very, I mean, to be very honest and frank, it's been disappointing not being able to complete the sale with them, because our goal with them was to be able to also get them into various art departments, because many of our students are not actually design students. And so being able to give them access to the like different parts of the university and to be able to use different kind of creative modalities to situate this work and to situate themselves and to express themselves. Yeah, so unfortunately that hasn't been able to take place. So what we're doing now is mainly focusing on reading and focusing on getting the boating licenses. And the readings have also been really like fantastic. So the students have been able to kind of take this theoretical work and like situate themselves as Black and brown bodies, like in nature, which is another part of the running thread of this. When thinking about escape, you know, that inevitably is going to get you to natural spaces, which in this country, our relationship to those natural spaces is so fraught. So yeah, so we've been being able to engage with the students on that level, I think has been really beneficial, even though we haven't been able to make the sale.
Yeah. And what's the natural space behind you? Is that your photograph?
Oh yeah, that is one of my photographs. That actually was taken in New York, I want to say in about 2009, at a nature preserve.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, you are correct in some ways, Deborah. Just think through the fact that my course is largely a course about reading and thinking, being critical together and creative together. But it also had other consequences, because the course is also a course about things, right? About material things. And so one of the part of the course that was important is for students to go to museums, to actually go inside the museum, to look at how museums write about their collections, write about ownership. And that we have to stop that. Another part, which was, this was supposed to happen, this was the class before everything closed down. We were supposed to meet together to discuss case studies. So each person would bring a important case study, whether or not it's the Benin bronzes or other important objects that they want to think through critically. But we were planning to do that actually at the museum in the storage, because that gave us the opportunity to embed our conversation in practice and what is at stake in that kind of practice. A part of what we are interested in this course is also just simply to look at the documentation of objects, right? And what slips on the details of a documentation card when ownership or provenance information is not there. So it created that distance between us and the things themselves, which at UPenn here, where a lot of anthropology is also taught through material culture, there's something about that makes it harder. One cannot come in contact with the thing itself. But that being said, there's another side of it that I think is interesting in that run up to trying to go online. It got us to start thinking about other things, which I think is important to say at this point, which is, you know, one of the things about teaching for me is that teaching must be a careful and caring environment. And how do you care for students? How do you create that environment of care for them to learn as well? And so in a way, one of the things you're starting to think about in this is what even is the ethics of teaching at this moment? You know, what is at stake in us thinking about the fact that students need to set aside this amount of time. They're spread across wherever they have to go, but we have to set a time together, knowing that they might have to care for family, they have to care for children. All of these things came into play. And so the demand for a course that was embedded in an idea of how questions of redistribution, heritage redistribution, and how heritage participates in questions of precarity, this moment demanded that we think about something else as well. That they're inhabiting a particular kind of human, non-human precarity that needed to be attended to in the class itself. So one also has to think about, it made me anyway think about what does it mean to teach in this moment.
Also, just to piggyback off of what Wayne's saying, in terms of what is it to teach at this moment, and to think also about how escape is coming into play, and thinking about our students having to make literal escapes from their dorms.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, yeah, it's driven in these subtle ways. It's sort of driven home the content.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, you've talked about a little bit about how, you know, the current changed reality has affected your courses, but the things that your courses are attempting to deal with in terms of repair, in terms of care, in terms of escape, also are themes that are very central within your own work. So I'm wondering, you know, how has what's happening now with, you know, the virus, but also thinking about our social lives differently, you know, physical distancing, the kind of precarity that we're sort of seeing as in much more stark terms. Like, how has all of this influenced the way you think about your own work as creative producers right now?
So, good question. For me, there's just been urgency.
Mm.
It's really overwhelming urgency. I'm not entirely sure about exactly what and for exactly what, and what that all looks like, really, but there's just, I mean, a lot of this work, the idea for this class came out of, honestly, out of, you know, Trump's election, and having this sort of palpable urge of feeling unsafe. And there are, you know, there have been plenty of times where I've felt unsafe in this country, but this just felt so much more overt. And then again, it's just been redoubled at this point. So I think for me, I'm just trying to kind of stay centered and stay moving forward, and understanding that the work, whatever it may be, has a really has an important space and an important place at this moment. To be thinking about, you know, how do you construct a sale, or what does survival look like? What do economic systems of survival look like? I mean, all of those questions are swirling around. Nothing's really landed yet. All I know is that I gotta keep making stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've been afraid of a question like that, primarily because my easy answer is that this situation, my easy answer nowadays is that I don't know in this situation. There's something about me for a long time now in the work that we do in my museums, you know, the Tropical Museum, Museum for African and Africa Museum, that I've been worried about the need always to come up with an answer so quickly to things, right? That there is a certain idea of us as experts to have an answer to everything. This is not to suggest that the museum is that we're doing amazing work. That's not it. But us as museums, as curators, as academics, there is a way in which you know, you get called by the media to answer the question, so what is this now? And in a funny way, this moment has caused me to think that to demand a certain humility of, or place me in a space of humility, to be able to suggest that I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know even what I feel sometimes in this kind of situation. So many museums are putting online, you know, things that they think should help society spend the time at home, you know, so they online tours and this and that. And when I first thought about this in conversation with my own colleagues in the Netherlands, my answer was, I don't know. I don't know what I would put online at this point to address this situation. And in a funny way, I want to suggest that that is a position that is okay to take. I absolutely don't know.
Yeah.
But there is another sense in, I saw this colleague, friend of mine, Gus Hash from Australia. He posted something recently online about social distancing and around this notion of social distancing and what is at stake in that, as you know, as we try to care for each other, to protect each other, not only about ourselves. But I also wondered in this moment recently, what does togetherness look like in this time of social distancing? What is at stake in developing certain kinds of coalitions for future practices in this time of social distancing? You know, how does togetherness work now when one cannot come together? And you know, Zoom is here and we're zooming, and that's nice. And my son can walk into the room to disturb my conversation, and it's wonderful. But there's something else about, I think, that we need to think about in terms of our future, to ask the question, what is this togetherness that we're trying to build when perhaps what the COVID-19 has said to us again and again is how fundamentally precarious we all are. And what does that demand of us to try and fashion other worlds, future worlds, which cares more deeply, harder? And that's why I wanted to talk about love in the last conversation, which loves each other as humans to try and fashion other futures for all of us, where we realize now that COVID-19 says to us again and again that those who were made most precarious, whether by the colonial project or capitalism or its conjoined nature, are the ones who are continually precarious in the present. What is togetherness? And a future of togetherness in this moment is what I also ask when social distancing is the narrative that comes up. So yeah, the answer to your question, in this moment, I really don't know.
Yeah.
It's a hard, vulnerable time, and I don't know what answers to give about, yeah, in a sense.
I will say too, that question about togetherness has come up a lot for me in my other side work, you know, running the space and being a DJ and being a person that gathers folks. There's definitely a lot of question about like, what does it mean to be together? It's been interesting kind of dealing with all of this, like the socializing aspect, this digital socializing that we've been doing. And there's something wonderful. I feel like I'm connecting with people I haven't seen in ages and with new folks. So that's really great. But like to your point, you know, when this all lifts, when we all come back together, will that be a tentative experience? Will that be a like deeply connecting, bonding, loving experience? But this issue of love and care, especially with the precarity that is here, especially for vulnerable folks, you know, I constantly going over and thinking about just the baseline love, like the baseline love. I wonder how this whole response would be if love was at more of a center here instead of economics.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, to be fair, that is a type of love. It's just misplaced.
It's another kind of love.
Yeah, right. Love of green. So, all right.
Yeah, well, it's a partial love, and it's a particular love, and it's not a universal love. And
yeah,
you know, people have been talking a lot about when things get back to normal, you know, which is so jarring to me because I don't know what that looks like at this point. And it seems to me part of the stillness that we're all experiencing right now should also require us to reimagine the normal.
yeah.
You know, and you know, I'm as big as of a culprit as anybody else. I've been zipping here and there for conferences or research trips or to see people or whatever. You know, my carbon footprint is probably bigger than the sort of majority of persons on the planet. But I think what this moment of stillness should extract from us is a kind of reflection about what that normalcy should look like, given that what we see every day on the various news media, you know, that people might be watching. I mean, many people have been doing this online forever. And that's, for me, that's new. I've never really been a big social media person. And so I'm feeling rather overwhelmed actually at all the new Facebook friend invitations and all of that stuff that I've been getting. But even in the live dance parties that have been going on, which have been fantastic, or the yoga classes or whatever, I still feel like we haven't really reckoned with what normalcy should look like. And I, like you, don't have an answer, Wayne. I can't say what I think it should be, but I feel like we shouldn't be in a rush, to quote unquote, get back to normal,
Yeah, especially when normalcy is so insufficient for so many people.
Yeah.
I mean, even if I'm honest, like even for, you see it with folks in power, it's insufficient for them too. There's so much harm, there's so much hurt, there's so much trauma being enacted out on folks. So I'm wondering, like you, Deb, in this come down, this very massive come down, is there a place to recalibrate? What does work mean? What does overwork mean? What does underwork mean? What does balance then look like?
Yeah. But also, I mean, actually, the invitation perhaps is not to ask the question, when do we go back to normal, but how do we not go back to normal?
Yeah.
Because we understand that normal, what is normal is in many ways what is also violent. And so to say go back to normal is, do we go back to violence? So I'm interested in, and that's why I want to ask the question or go back to the idea of what togetherness might look like.
Yes.
Because I'm interested to also ask, how does this reorganize just how we think about questions of care and caring and careful lives, careful futures, and how do we embed those into future practice, right? What is at stake? And that is as individuals, as co-members of this on this planet, but as cultural institutions. So how do we imagine and make real new norms that are more careful and caring? And so for me, I would hope that this is about how do we learn to not be normal again. Yeah, that's what I'd like. What is at stake in that? And that is not to trivialize anything, because or the gravity of what the situation is. I'm just suggesting that in the gravity of this situation, we also need to attend to the fact that the unequal distribution of precarity that this situation also makes clear is something that cannot be renormalized.
Yeah, whose kids are thriving in remote learning, for example, and who doesn't have Wi-Fi, so they will
exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Because even in this, even in this moment of Zoom parties or whatever, it also says that some of us can do that. Yeah. Some of us are able to keep connected, and others of us not. And it demands that we think so much more about what life should be like.
Yeah, this moment is really, it's laying bare a lot of structural, stuff that obviously we've known is there, but it just makes it in such stark relief right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the structural inequalities.
Yeah,
and I think, as people, scholars, artists, practitioners who think a lot about the legacies of earlier moments of violence, imperialism, colonization, dispossession of land, slavery, the violence of non-personhood and how that lives, in the present, like these forms of structural inequality as we see them sort of enacting themselves today, with who's getting help, who's getting care, who dies from this, who doesn't die from this,
have their property taken away. In service to the collective.
Yeah. And what's been interesting to me, well, two things. One has been I think the first week of sequestration and trying to think about how am I going to teach this class online, not I personally, but we all, how are we going to continue with the kind of work that we do in an online dimension and sort of care for students and deal with their different realities while still trying to accomplish some kind of conversation that was envisioned, earlier in the quote unquote normal world. That, the first week of doing that felt calm. Everything was being canceled. And there's a kind of grief and a mourning that accompanied the cancellations, but then it just felt liberating, and it felt like, on some level. And then by the second week, when everybody figured out how to do everything online, I felt actually really pressured with the intensification of digitality. I have to go to this online thing and this online thing, and this talk, which was going to be in person, is now going to be broadcast. And, it felt really like the digital world suddenly felt hectic, in a kind of way. And I'm interested in what you think about that. And then the second thing that happened was just a proliferation of emails around arts. People sharing festivals, putting films online free, artists putting their own work online free, giving access, not everybody, because everybody can't afford to give access, but people providing access to the creativity of the mind, the body, and the spirit in ways that, or in recognition that, I guess, and I think we all believe in this to some extent, but I found it really striking, that this is what's life-sustaining in these kinds of moments. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about both things. One, the kind of inculcation into the world of digitality in social distancing, and then two, how the arts become this kind of space for, I don't know, reclaiming life or reclaiming humanity, or, how do we account for these simultaneous processes?
Yeah. I'll go on the first one and I'll piggyback on Emily on the second one. The first one, the thing is, there is that moment, and here actually it was interesting that they there was this extension of the spring break, so one had a longer period to be able to even just adjust to things, and also in my own organization trying to come to, and I've been operating in two different worlds. I'm here now at Penn in the US where the UPenn rules are operating, and then I'm also in the Netherlands where different modes of responses are happening, both in my museum and university. But one of the interesting things is that, and my colleagues at work also say that in the Netherlands say that there's a way in which one's calendar, one's agenda starts to get empty. And in that emptying, one has certain kind of calm. It gives you a kind of a little bit more realism about, geez, I had so many meetings. I was always going to meetings. And so all of these meetings get canceled. And you start asking yourself the question, is there another way to operate? Could we have done it otherwise? Can we organize ourselves in I don't want to use the word efficient, but better ways, so that we are not dominated by this bureaucracy. But then what you see and what you allude to that is that actually then we don't really make any choices. We don't really make the concrete choices to say, let's really prioritize what meetings are to be had. And we see our calendars start filling in very quickly after. So we actually move back very quickly to an old norm, an old kind of norm of filling calendars and whatever. And I would like us to pause a little, to perhaps to start thinking more critically about how did that 2 weeks allow us to make choices? What is at stake? What is important? Is it more important for me just to have a conversation with my staff, which has no agenda, but just simply to talk about how are they doing? you know, or with the students. How are you doing right now? Than to be in this machinery of efficiency and whatever. So that was the first thing that came to me when you said that. And if Emily goes, then I'll piggyback because I have a lot to say about the arts thing, but I'll piggyback on that afterwards.
Okay. Yeah, I think I noticed that I haven't gotten less busy.
I'm going to have to pull a cord to pull my computer together because its battery's just done. So I'm coming back. Go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like I mean, for me, some of this is also like my own neuroses and the come down of this. So my schedule, it's starting to thin out, but all of a sudden I got filled up with so many social engagements online. Like it was, so it's been in some ways really wonderful to be able to connect in this way, but I'm a really material person. So it's also hard, the physical distancing of this. I was thinking when Wayne was talking about energetic waste, like in thinking about like, you know, yes, a ton of meetings and what could be taken care of in a phone call, but because we've gone kind of so far away from that, except for now it's coming back again, yeah, like emails for me are not always the most efficient way to communicate. But at any rate, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. I don't really, this time has been so fascinating and revealing and interesting, certainly fearful, but also very interesting to see. It just sort of feels like we're having a worldwide, just like everybody needs to come down to earth. We're gonna take a pause. We're gonna do some healing. We're gonna literally do caregiving because we have to. And we're gonna think really long and hard about what caregiving means. And I'm curious to see what comes out of that.
Yeah. And so what about the proliferation of sort of artistic offerings?
That's been also amazing and overwhelming. I think if I'm being honest, like my relationship with the art world has been so up and down and so back and forth in terms of my comfortability in that space. I think a lot of my artistic career has been kind of internally defined by that. So it's been interesting for me because I've been just really excited in some ways to see what folks have been doing. How, you know, museums and galleries are responding, certainly, but also how other artists are responding and how, you know, freely they're giving of themselves in their work. And I think, Deb, you were saying, you were talking about that, and I totally, certainly agree. It seems like I don't want to say like a renaissance of some kind, but maybe that's what it is. And it really points to just the fundamental. It was almost immediate that arts and culture became a central focal point on top of the COVID like outbreak, you know. That is the thing that's getting us through in terms of, you know, keeping us distracted, sometimes keeping us in like on a steady schedule, you know, if you have like, I don't know, programs that are coming out at a steady rate, and also injecting in some ways like a little bit of a sense of normalcy with some of this. So I've loved it. I've really loved it. I have a lot of questions about like where it goes and what it looks like, and I've been personally questioning myself about how do I engage with that? How am I going to choose to be public? Does my voice even need to be there? You know, yeah.
You know, I have probably a slightly different engagement with it, primarily because I'm from the institution itself, right? So as I said to you, many museums like ours have been struggling to try and understand what can we do, what can we offer the public in general for a little bit of normalcy in a very not normal time. So that's been a part of it, but at another sense, one of my, all right, let me do the positive part, because everybody knows me, I'm always going to the negative quickly. But but the positive is actually through literature and poetry and So I've seen so many things online, right, where the literary is being brought to bear on what to do or how did we attend to this in a different moment. I saw a poem recently online by Barbara Kingsolver, or there has been an ongoing discussion about Carmu's The Plague. So all of this has been suggesting that there is a way in which arts practice, cultural production can help us to think about the present and or our current situation, but also, you know, what futures could we expect or how did we deal with it in the past. What has animated my conversation, my thinking more is actually the precarity of artists and artistic practice at this time. That's what has been, I've been attending to more, because I've had artists with whom I work, friends as artists, whose shows have been canceling and, you know, not having the commission that they had before, or because many of them work as freelancers, you know, outside of a fixed contract. What does that mean? So it has been animating me more to try and think through, you know, that relationship between institutionalization and institutionalized work and the work of those whose contracts are much more fluid or less secure. For our museums, we've also had to think about that because we also employ a lot of people or work with a lot of artists. So what do you do as an institution to ensure that those who don't have contracts can have some assurance during this period? So that has been a part of, so while I see the side of the artist production as being very hopeful, I also see a certain sense in which there are many spaces that have been asking the question, how do we care for arts and arts practices in this time? And there are positives. You know, I see, for example, in Germany or in the Netherlands, where they are saying, the cultural ministers come out to say, we will support artists during this period, or we will set aside this amount of money for the arts in this period until we've moved through it. So that side of it as well has also caused me anxiety to again ask the question, how does this become a moment where redistribution helps us to care for everybody? And that's something that has been animating my interest.
Can I also, to piggyback on that point, Wayne, that's something that's been of huge concern, certainly to me, to my community. I think it's been interesting also to situate artists as workers. I think in some ways in our society, certainly, we're not really situated as workers.
Yeah.
In the same way. Like we don't even come up in data in the same way as workers. A lot of the benefits that we derive are sort of by kind of a loose extension, but we're not put as a focal point. And I think something that's been rattling around for me is also like, for a lot of artists, we'll just give of ourselves because this is what we do.
Yeah.
Like, and I see this now, certainly with everybody, you know, folks getting their work up and sharing it so liberally. And I wonder in some ways if, you know, our willingness and our readiness to be able to give of ourselves, like puts us in kind of a tough position negotiating wise in terms of the economics of it and having space, because I think we can easily get taken advantage of. Like, oh, they're going to do it anyway.
Yeah. I was wondering, Emily, you know, more specifically in terms of your own work, you know, is the Chicago show still?
Yeah, I mean, I will tell you, everything is up in the air. I've lost, you know, shows, teaching gigs, talks. At the moment, you know, we're just sitting here in a holding pattern. And I think in some ways, like the making of the art is like the twiddling of the thumbs. So, you know, the crew here, we're small, we're nimble, we're thinking about how we want to situate ourselves, what the future looks like. We're okay-ish for now, But, you know, if this goes on for a number of months, then we'll have to have another conversation. And then also in that, right, especially because there's a medical concern, what does fundraising look like? What does securing our future look like? And I guess to your point, Wayne, like, and also for me, it's not a massive institution, it's a cute little tiny one, but I think about like who's in a situation like this and something that's so broad and with a response that's so botched, whose responsibility is it to take care of? Employees, institutions, all of these things.
And I think it's such a pressing question in terms of how funding structures work in different countries for different arts and cultural institutions. I mean, with the endowments of foundations and other kinds of grant-giving organizations plummeting, you know, as the stock market falls, it means, you know, less kind of consideration and ability to really support the work of artists, researchers, etc. And I think it's a somewhat different situation in many contexts in Europe where, you know, a state sort of supports, or the different kinds of museums are tied to the state, like in the UK, for example. Yeah. You know, so I think it really does sort of create the space for institutions to think about how do we best support the various constituencies who are in our orbit. I mean, I know for me, for my small space or our small space of the center, it's like, okay, we have students right now who are submitting grants for summer work, you know, creative work, research work. I don't even know how to evaluate those right now, you know, and I guess one decides, okay, well, we have to evaluate as if they're going to happen, and then figure it out as the time comes, you know, how they happen differently because of the, you know, of the current conditions. I don't know necessarily if we have a budget for next year, you know, given the way things are changing so much. So, you know, it's how do we support the students? How do we support different students with very different needs? The MFA students, for example, are in a very different position right now than the PhD students. And I think it's a time to really imagine differently, like, how do we put money toward art? You know, and it's not usually, I think, how we think about creative work. Creative work is something that's born of the spirit. It's something you have to do. You know, yes, but it's something that if that is your job, you know, also you have to be supported in doing it economically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I asked an interesting question also earlier, Emily, which had to do with archiving. And I wanted to ask you more, just as we start to wrap things up, you know, what were you thinking about in terms of creating an archive? Is that creating an archive of this moment, or is it how do we archive the kind of practices that are taking place today, or what was in your mind when you were raising the question of the archive?
You know, what's interesting, I watched the movie Bacurau last night, and there's this scene in like it's about a town in Brazil, and in this town they have the town museum is like the thing, and so you go into it and it's all these familial objects and just the story of the town, and there's a situation happens in there in this museum in this place, and you know the curator, there's this moment where the curator walks through and it says, keep that bloody footprint, clean the floor, don't touch anything. So to keep and preserve the event that happened there, to be able to tell. And so in thinking about the archive, there is the question for me of preserving this moment, both in, you know, these digital conversations, which I think, you know, Zoom's recording, there's a lot of recordings that are gonna be going out. Also in the medical immediacy that is happening, how that's affecting people's lives. I think all of that should be taken down, not just for the cultural aspect of it, but also for, you know, future folk to be able to understand how do people get through? How do you get through like such dire consequences, like situations, you know? big or small. So I think, you know, that's one of those pieces. And I keep wondering about physically, how does that work? I mean, are we talking about giant institutions that take so much to run? When you start to become kind of a material collector and archivist, it's, you know, you always have to be dealing with space. So, and then digitally, you're also running into the issues of like server farms and things like this. So, yeah, archiving has become an interesting point for me because I think a lot of it touches on like our structures as much as it does on, you know, maintaining our sense of history, where we've been and where we're going. So I don't know. I don't have a lot of answers about any of that, but I'm just constantly curious about it.
You know, I'm in a way, I working in a museum as I do, and working in, so one could say, a material archive that I do. I'm I think that we will make do with this, the archiving this moment. I think we kind of always make do in archiving these moments, because for me the archive is always distributed. It is distributed in many senses. It is the archive that I may collect as a museum or as a library, or you know, which is about documents and objects and things. But at this moment, this ties exactly back with Deborah's earlier question, that the kinds of artistic work that might emerge, the kinds of creative work that might emerge in response to this moment, is also an archive of this moment. The kinds of ethnographies that are going to be written or done is also a part of the archive of this moment. And so the question for me is, in terms of preserving, it is going to be preserved. For me, it's actually, how do we preserve in that, not the big narratives or the power structures or the national stories, or actually for me recently, how do we preserve those other places that are dealing with this issue in less good ways than we might be doing that? Because that's one of the difficulties with archives. What my course does is suggest that a museum in Europe has, because of its power, because of its coloniality, because of all of what it had behind it, could archive the lives of so many colonized peoples through practices of taking, exchange, stealing, all of those things. And that there are places in Jamaica that could not archive that because they didn't have the money. So how do we ensure that this moment of archiving is not another moment of absences, silences, violence through power? That would be what I would be interested to ask. And what do we do to ensure that all of those other spaces, their own responses, resiliences, hopes, are also being attended to in this archival moment, if we want to call it that. There's this one book I teach with my students, not this one, but I had a course which I don't longer teach called What Nations Remember. And I teach always Michel Rolfe Trujillo's Silencing the Past. And there's this one statement in it, which is such a Marxian statement, where he speaks about the distribution of power to be able to write histories. How do we ensure that we organize that redistribution in some ways, that the archive of tomorrow is one that remembers those who we always forget? And that would be how I would be interested in thinking of this archival as an archival moment, and what we should be doing to ensure that something happens.
Yeah, definitely. Right? How to promote the voices that have been
Yes, the voices.
the violence. Yeah.
The voices against violence. Yes.
Great. Well, you know, I really appreciate both of you. We have learned so much from you in the part of the semester where we've been able to be in more dynamic interaction. So pleased to have you at Penn for the semester, and hoping that this would really be the beginning of a longer long-term relationship that can unfold in different ways and that can archive the continuity of our connections to each other, both within the city of Philadelphia and of course, you know, overseas in different kinds of ways. I really appreciate your willingness to be here to deal with the monumental changes that have happened during your time with the center. And I'm just very thankful that you've been with us, you know, mind, body, and spirit.
I want to say something before you go though, because something that struck me that I never anticipated before, and you told me, but I'm notoriously bad at this. In actually inviting us together, that was actually such a beautiful, prescient thing to do. Primarily because in my conversation with Emily as well, these questions of gendered craft practices or questions around skills and thinking about skill are also things that my own work engages with. And so one of the amazing things that has happened in our interaction, and I can assure you that Emily and I will continue talking, and I'm going to invite her to the Netherlands. I'm going to continue. I want to think more with her and about her work, is that there is a way in which her practice is a practice because of its tactility, because of its hands-onness, because of its love about caring, a material form of caring for things that actually ties so much with some of the work that I'm interested in doing as a museum. And I don't know how to do that yet. So, but what I'm saying is thank you for introducing us, because in thinking with Emily's work, I think we're going to have another conversation in how do we translate this hands-on, tactile care towards the institution, so that it can also be a caring and careful space. So thank you for that. And thanks, Emily. It's great meeting you.
Oh, wait, thank you so much. And it was wonderful to meet you too. And I just want to say, certainly to second that, thank you, Deb, so much for this. It's been an amazing experience. And I'll be honest with you, before we got linked up, I think I had kind of extracted in some ways out, even though my work takes a ton of research, the academic, it wasn't something that was situated in an academic space, even though I use academia to help me do this work. So I can't tell you how appreciative I am that that my work has a home in this space, and that it can be, you know, talked about in this broader context. It's a complete humbling honor, and I'm very, very grateful for this experience, for sure.
I think one of the things that we're all interested in, certainly the three of us here, and I think all of the faculty from across the different schools who are working with the center, and certainly our students, has to do with the forms of repair that we can generate. And I certainly feel like the kinds of care that both of you demonstrate, you know, in your different spaces are signals towards some of the kinds of historical and contemporary repair that are necessary. So you know, I am humbled by your presence, and I'm really, again, grateful and thankful for this conversation, even though it's on Zoom. And I know Wayne is intending to head back to the Netherlands and finish out the semester online from that space next week. So I want to also say safe journey, and we will all be in touch. Thank you very much.
Yeah, man, blessings. All right, bye-bye.
All right.